If you've ever taken a class or read a book on graphics design, you'll know that they try to cover all the different elements that go into creating print advertising. They'll talk about color, the use of images, the layout of the objects on the paper, how to group them to be most effective to convey the message you want. And then finally they'll talk about what font or typeface style to use for the written language that's going to be on the advertisement itself. So in your quest to have the perfect actor resume for your auditions, hopefully you've seen my other videos on the Gutenberg diagram and on anchoring and so on, and you're reworking your resume. Well, picking the right font is also just as important as knowing where the layout of the information goes on your resume. So today I want to cover a few things. I want to talk about the three different families or groups that fonts are classified in. Then I'm going to show you some examples of using each of those families of fonts on a resume so you can see how effective it is or not in conveying information. And then I want to wrap up with a short talk about the use of different sizes of fonts on your resume itself. Okay, so let's get started. So for our purposes, we're just going to look at three families of fonts. You'll see why once I go through them, why we're only looking at these three for our samples. The first one is script font, and it's designed to mimic handwriting. So that's why you've got all these loops and curly cues and so on. There you have samples like Script, Blackadder, Edwardian, Harlow Solid. Now, to show you why this, in my opinion, is the worst font to pick for your resume, I've created an actor resume using only the Script font. As you can see, even though it sort of looks cool close up if you're looking at it, it's really difficult to read ultimately. Okay, there's a term in graphics design called noise, and what it refers to is when the information that's on a page is so hard to take in. They say that the layout of the design is too noisy, and this is really noisy. It's so hard to take in the individual words that you lose the message you're trying to get across with all the information. So this is one to stay away from. Any kind of script font, stay far away from it. The next font is called a serif font, and serif refers to this little tiny hanging down thing that comes off the T, or that comes off the side here at the A, or off the top of the R, right? Those are called serifs. Times New Roman is probably one of the most widely used fonts in the world for newspapers, for magazines, and books. It was created around 1930 for the Times of London, the newspaper. They had been using an older version of this, which they called Times Old Roman, but then they updated it, and this was the font that they came up with. And these are some derivatives of that. There's Georgia, Imprint, Shadow, Stencil. And in all the cases, they have, the reason why you know it's a serif font is it's got little stuff pointing off the edges of the letters. Okay? So this is what my actor resume would look like given that. And, you know, Times New Roman is perfectly serviceable. It's also, you know, the default setting for a Microsoft Word doc. So this is why most actors' resumes look like this. But there's a couple of drawbacks. The first one is that very fact. Most actors' resumes look like this. Because most actors don't take the time to think about what font to use, their fonts all look the same. They're Times New Roman. I think it's important, you know, if you're going to spend the time to develop your resume, postcards, website, by having a distinctive font that's yours, it makes a visual theme across all the different advertising pieces. The other really big problem with Times New Roman, with a serif font, is that actors, when they start overfilling their resume and making things really small, the typeface really starts to break down and become too noisy. Now right now, the size of this typeface here, this font, is 12, and it's pretty easy to read. But when you start to reduce it to, say, 10 or even 8, it's sort of like reading the fine print in a legal document. and it's much too hard, and once again it gets noisy. So our last font is called sans serif. Sans meaning without. You'll see there are no hanging down things off the T or the A or the R or anywhere. Sans serif fonts became really popular after World War II. The one that really started it off was one made in Switzerland called Helvetica. If you've ever looked at the sign for the New York City subway system, all the information, that's Helvetica. That's the font. And these are derivatives of that. Arial, Tahoma, Verdana, Eurostyle. And once again, you can distinguish them because they don't have any kind of serifs hanging off the letters. They're nice and blocky, which makes them really easy to read. Now, here's that resume again in a font called Tahoma. As you can see, it's a very easy font to read. It's got a nice solid look to it. And there's a couple of things I want to talk about, not only with this particular font style, but with now about how to use font sizes on the resume. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got about putting my resume together is that you should think of your resume as the front page of a newspaper for a couple of reasons. Think of this up here, this area up here, as sort of the masthead. That's the top of the newspaper. And they say, what's the name of the newspaper? The name of this newspaper is Sean Pratt. And these would be sort of like, contact information for the paper or the stock quotes and so on. And then this is the body of, the front page of the newspaper, and these would be stories, you might say. So when you're thinking about how big to make your fonts, if you start thinking in terms of a newspaper front page, it makes sense that your name should be the largest thing on the resume, followed by your contact information and your stats, and then going down slightly smaller, the categories like stage, and this is a little bit of film and education and training, and then the smallest font size would be for the actual information itself. So these are at 12, so I'm sort of guessing that this is probably 14. This information here is probably 16, and this is in the 20s, like 28 size font. But if you think of, once again, if you think of the resume as the front page of a newspaper, it'll help you decide how big you want the fonts to go. One last thing about the newspaper analogy. When you get a newspaper, you never get it open-faced like this. It's always folded in half. And in the newspaper industry, they call that, if you were to draw a line across here, that's the fold line. And they say that everything above the fold or below the fold. So the most important story of the day goes above the fold. It's the headline, the thing you want to read first. So this being my theater resume, I want my theater credits to be above the fold. So when I walk into audition at that theater, they'll see my theater credits first, and at the bottom I've included a couple of film credits, but not many. So once again, use the newspaper analogy when laying this out. So there you have it. Sans serif fonts are by far the best choice when you're picking typefaces to go on your resume. They're cleaner, they're clearer. I just like the look and feel of them a lot. To me, it's an obvious choice. Also, something to keep in mind, once you find a font that you really like, you should use that font on all your materials that come out of your office, whether it's the letterhead you have, your thank you cards. If you have a website, if you can get that font for the typeface for the website, great. It's a small detail, but if you take that kind of time and care to have all the stuff match visually, it sends a good message to the viewer. It's a real subtle thing, but it's worth doing. Also, please remember about the newspaper idea, that if you think of your resume as the front page of a newspaper, that'll help you in choosing the right size font to use for pieces of information on the page itself. And finally, before I go, I just wanted to mention, if you haven't already, I would really like it if you could sign up for my newsletter. You just go to my homepage, SeanPrattPresents.com, put your email address in the box, and You can have my videos and my articles and everything else that I send out in the newsletter delivered right to your inbox. Or you can also follow me on Facebook. Just type in Sean Pratt Presents and you can find me that way as well. Good luck at your next audition.